My name is Clarissa Vela, and I will be going over my CAA number 3 historical timeline. This will be for Professor Sutton. Again, my name is Clarissa Vela, and I'm going over the CAA number 3 historical timeline. This will be covered for the class of EDTP 1100. For this timeline, we had to create 10 important events or laws that covered the bilingual education part. The ones that I picked, I kind of just did research over which timeline kind of created them. We did read some over in the chapters, but I felt like I needed to research a little more of them because I didn't find so many throughout the chapters. So the first one that I am doing, it is over the first law for bilingual education, and this one happened in 1839. For the first law of the bilingual education, this one dealt with the state of Ohio. Ohio was the very first state to allow bilingual teaching throughout the public schools. In the public schools, they were authorizing German English instruction, but this was at the parents' request. If the parents didn't request it, it wasn't very much of a big deal as it seemed to be. But the only reason that this was the first state to allow the bilingual education part was because Ohio had a good population of the German immigrants. With all the immigrants coming in, of course, they wanted to have enough bilingual going on. They didn't want to just focus on one language. They kind of wanted to expand the languages that people were learning or how they were being taught. This also was not to replace any language as like the English-speaking language. It did not want to be replaced. They just wanted to create a growth between the German language speakers with the American schools. So basically, it just wanted to be enhanced for this one. The second one that I covered was the Nationality Act, and this one occurred in 1906. This law, it required all immigrants to apply for citizenship, but to also learn the national language. At this time, technically, the national language, of course, was the English-speaking language, as we all know. But these immigrants, of course, again, they didn't really have that much English language speaking. They didn't have a very good background on it. And for them to become a citizen, a clean background was needed. But they also had to have a record of living here, like in this area, from about 4 to 5 years. If they didn't, I don't believe that they qualified for anything to become a citizen. And this year, during this era, it was actually referred to as the progressive or the industrial era, just because of everything that was occurring. And the Nationality Act, it was also approved on June 29th of 1906. The next one I covered was the National Defense Education Act, and this one happened in 1958. This act was to encourage all students to continue education past high school years. So basically for this one, the way I took it was there was not very much education going on, maybe past like a high school level, not even like in a college level. There wasn't a very big percentage. So they wanted to increase this percentage for people to take it basically to their advantage and use it for everything that they could. This decision for this act was because it was believed schools and colleges did not have a good education on scientific specials. This meaning it didn't really deal with the science parts. It wasn't giving the qualifications that probably should have been going on during the school time. Another act was passed also that was related to the National Defense Education Act, and the other act that was passed was the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which is also known as NASA. So during this time, this was basically a scientific era during 1958, technically with the Sputnik part. I'm not sure if a lot of people knew about that, but this was basically dealing with the Sputnik era. And the next one I covered, it was known as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I feel like this one was a very big act to know about just because last week in the digital journal activity, I did cover mine over the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This one really dealt with the law of segregation, basically going throughout the schools. They wanted to kind of end the segregation. They didn't want people to feel like they did not have the exact same rights as others, because this is what they were trying to do throughout, the nation and the school. They wanted everybody to have a chance at doing something. And there were many leaders who actually were going on throughout this one. This one really, it kind of dealt with a lot of like the outlaws on discrimination, based on the race, color, religion, anything that had to deal with any type of segregation is what this act dealt with. This act is what ended, though, the segregation throughout the public areas, so it did kind of give a good benefit. This one also, it did create equal opportunity for everyone, so it wasn't kind of just one-sided, it was two-sided. Other people did have an option of doing what they wanted to do during this time throughout the schools, especially for the women. Women were starting to kind of get a bigger, how can I say this? They kind of had a bigger advantage than what they were used to. Martin Luther King Jr. was also known as the civil rights leader during this time. He was doing a lot of things for this part. And lastly, this was also to help create an expansion for the disability, or the elderly and women in general. So this you kind of had to qualify within these three parts of either having a disability, being elder, or just being a woman in general. This was kind of a big thing for these people. The next one I talked about was the ESEA. The ESEA is known as Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and this one just occurred 1 year after the Civil Rights Act. This one happened in the year of 1965. This law was to qualify education, or to give quality education, sorry. I guess the way that I was seeing this one too is, I guess some people didn't really think that a lot of the students were getting an education that they should have been. Given the title, it is to have very high standards and accountability for the education field. And throughout the beginning years, they did have a few issues with the money part. Just basically, I guess, with the funds is how I can say it. They did have a few issues with funding for schools and what was going to happen there. And lastly, this was funded to help with schools and school districts who had a high percentage of students dealing with low-income families. And moving on to the next one I talked about was the ESEA Title 7, 1967. The ESEA, again, is known as the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And this one occurred 2 years after the act was going. This one happened in 1967. This was passed as an amendment for the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Senator Ralph Yarborough of Texas is the one who also introduced this, and in 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson is who signed. The BEA was to establish the first federal policy aiding the student of the LESA. And Lau versus Nicholas, 1974, this one kind of had a short one. It was the term for sink or swim, and it was created referring to students who had little to no English speaking ability. And in this part, it was dealing with non-English speaking students, but these students were also known as Chinese. The next one I talked about was Serna versus Portales Municipales, and this happened in 1974. Spanish-speaking students did not have a big percentage during this time. It was also proven to be a language arts class was below average in not meeting students' needs. And in New Mexico, there was a good amount of Spanish surnamed residents. Students who were Spanish surnamed the children and had a high percentage of quitting school. The Colorado English for the Children initiative happened in 2001. This one was trying to require to have all students taught in the English language unless told otherwise. A waiver did have to be requested by a parent, and a student had to have well English speaking but had to be 10 years or older or have special needs. In the Colorado public schools, they were able to sue for enforcement. And lastly, the one I talked about was the NCLB. This was the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. This act dealt with many federal education programs by the states. This one, it wanted to close student achievement gaps by giving fair opportunities. And lastly, this ended with a requirement for all students to meet requirements such as a state testing. So as here in Texas, we take a STAR test, so this is one of the requirements that we are having to do. And at the very last slide, you will find all my sources to this activity. Thank you.